In this free pattern knit along, we will knit a tote that's reinforced with a milk jug or some other kind of jug. I'm planning on using mine for garden harvest. You could use it for your knitting tools, but of course, everybody has their own use for a tote. It's made of very sturdy yarn, plus it's reinforced with the jug bottom from a milk jug or some other recycled jug. So both pieces are highly washable and it's very, very strong. I'm making an exception to the usual advice I give when we use cotton yarn, where I tell you to wash and dry the swatch before measuring. You really don't have to here. That's because a snug fit around the jug is desirable, and when we wash it, we can block it right on the jug again. I did a survey amongst my knitting friends, and these are the most common sizes of milk jugs. Mine is a little bit different, so this video will include these 3 sizes plus quick notes on how to figure custom sizes. A written version of the pattern will appear in Country Knitting of Maine News and Views. People occasionally confuse Country Knitting of Maine with my business, theanswerlady.com, because we do work closely together. If you will stay tuned at the end of the video, I'll explain the relationship clearly. Start with the jug and trim the top off of it so that about 4 inches of the bottom remains. The cut need not be perfect, but do get rid of any jagged edges for safety. To figure the stitch count for an unusual size of jug, measure the longest distance, we'll call it the length, multiply it times 4, the stitch gauge, and add 2. Measure the other dimension, we'll call it the width, multiply it times 4, and add 2. Adding 2 gives us a seaming stitch on each side. If your jug is one of these sizes, you don't have to figure, just use the stitch count given here, 24, 5, or 6 stitches, and cast them on. I recommend casting on by chaining around the needle shanks, and expect it to feel a little bumpy if you use the Conshohocken yarn, because it's got a wrap of thin thread around the main core, which is one of the things that gives it a nice texture and performance, but it does make it a little bit bumpy. Anyway, casting on around the needle shanks will give us a nice seam when we need to make one. And by the way, the tool that I'm using is from my Cheap Tricks and Cool Tools book. Expect the first row to be stiff, as you saw, because we're knitting this yarn at a relatively tight stitch size for the nature of the yarn. If I were knitting a garment out of it, I would usually use a larger stitch size, but I want a firm fabric for this. It'll get easier. Now we just knit to the row count that will allow us to cover the entire bottom of the jug. If you have one of the standard sizes, then use the chart that I gave you to determine the row count. If not, multiply your row gauge by the distance that this fabric needs to cover. I did the math, but I'm going to double check here, and allowing for the fact that the material is still on the machine, it looks just fine. So now let's bind off using the around the gate pegs bind off. If you have a hobby machine, you're working on a plastic machine, the LK100 or a Bond, you will not be able to go around the gate pegs, but you can get the same effect with the transfer bind off. That looks like it's going to be a good fit. So now we're going to hang the sides one at a time on the machine. You'll hang one time behind the cast on and one time behind the bind off, and twice up the sides of the knitting. When hanging behind the cast on or bind off, hang stitch for stitch. Obviously you can't do that when hanging up the sides of the knitting, so use the needle count given here, or the one you determine by arithmetic. Now we knit the fabric that goes up one side of the jug, less 1 inch, because we want to make a hem to take account for that inch. Using a slightly different yarn, E-wrap every needle and knit another 12 rows. And I did something that I won't do next time. I did my double wrap of the first few to automatically weave in, and you see that in this yarn that was too difficult. Next time I'll show you how to do it differently, but I left it in to give you a heads up. Now hang either every E-wrap or every other E-wrap is really enough on the working needles and bind off, and that will close a hem. It's happening last, but it's going to be at the top of the knitting. Here's what we have so far, and it's looking very good. We now hang the opposite side from the one we began with and perform exactly the same operation, except this time I'm not going to have such a hard time with my hem. And I'm showing you one more thing for plastic machines. I moved the carriage across to the left from the right, assuming I want to be able to bind off from the right. That's why I went ahead and did this. And now I'm going to manually knit this row. And here's something you must watch for. Each needle must go in a separate opening. And I missed on the first one. If that happens, you won't get a true column of stitches. So I'm correcting it. But the main point of the step that we're now making is that if you manually knit the first row by laying the yarn in the needles and pulling back a stitch manually and trying to make it the same size as the carriage would do, that first row goes a lot more easily. A hobby machine very often won't knit a cotton bulky yarn that's bumpy right from the cast on, or it won't do it without complaining and being endangered. So just give it a little bit of help. Start off like this, and it's a piece of cake from then on. Now the working yarn goes into the carriage, and we knit 3 inches worth of rows, then stop, E-wrap, knit another 2 inches worth of rows, which will make a 1-inch hem. And see how much easier that was when I didn't double. Hang the E-wraps. Every other one is adequate and easier on the machine when we're using such a bulky, stiff yarn. And bind off. Now we have the bottom and 2 opposing sides complete, and we need to hang a third side. Be careful on sides 3 and 4 because the first 2 sides will go right to the corners of the knitting, and you want to make sure you get your full stitch count in. So after we've done sides 3 and 4, we have this, and we just need to seam the edges together. Each pair of rectangles gets seamed together. You can seam as well as I can, so I'll leave you to that. Do not seam through the casings. We'll be using those. Now we're going to make the I-cord strap. And I am going to cast on with double E-wrap. It's another little trick that makes it easier to work with a relatively thick, stiff, bulky yarn. And what it is we go under 2 needles, over 1, into the hook of the first, and pull back a stitch. So we end up with a complete stitch in every needle, and it knits off much more easily. That plus knitting back from hold and me holding down on the yarn tail for the first couple of rows will get us started. And then I can add a weight, and it'll knit nicely from then on. What you want to do is knit I-cord. This is really mock I-cord because we're not using any slip stitches. It's fine as it is. It'll roll on its own, and I can't see any good reason to double the work for very little effect. We're going to knit enough I-cord to encircle the jug 3 times. I used a big crochet hook for this, but use whatever method you like to run the I-cord through all of the top hems in order, one at a time. But then we're going to do something different to finish up and make the straps adjustable. There should still be plenty of I-cord. So skip the next segment and thread the remainder of the I-cord through the second one over. Then skip the next one and thread it again through the second one over. And that will leave us with 2 straps. Overlap the 2 ends of the I-cord and sew them together in as flat a manner as possible so that we can pull them inside one of the casings and hide them. And there they go into the casing. That'll be their permanent spot. Even though we knitted 4 inches of length and we cut the sides of the jug to 4 inches, very likely the hem will extend slightly above the top, which is really what we want because of the act of it stretching in use, even if it doesn't when you're doing this right now. Mine's just barely above. The goal of tweaking it into shape is to get it to fit nice and tightly all the way around the top and to have the straps the same length. And the trick to it is remembering that you have 2 circuits. So the first circuit, you have to find it by feel, but that's the one to get adjusted first, and then you can equal the straps up. And it's ready for use. Now, about the relationship between my website and business, theanswerlady.com, and Linda's website and business, Country Knitting of Maine. Country Knitting of Maine was already a well-established business buying and selling used machines and yarn and designing patterns. And I was already established with my website, selling patterns and books and teaching at seminars, and Jack was doing some repairs when Linda and I first met because she bought the magazine News and Views, which was already established. I applied to write for the magazine. She accepted, and we have worked together ever since. We cooperate and work very closely. I help her with a group on Facebook. We send each other business, but we are still 2 separate businesses and friends. It's nice when it works out that way. Some of my patterns appear both in books that I write and publish myself and also in Country Knitting of Maine News and Views. We also cooperate on a charity that Linda actually founded and runs called Keeping Maine Warm, and I try to contribute a lot of hats and encourage other people to donate hats. Can you imagine going through a Maine winter improperly attired? Good heavens. So we do collaborate and work quite closely. However, if you have a question about the magazine or a missing issue or subscribing, you would go to her website. And if you wanted to buy my books directly, you would either go to my website or Ravelry, where they're also available. What I'll do to make things easy for you is in the program notes, put links to my site, her site, and my Ravelry store, so you can go directly where you need to be.